You,
Yeah, or at least prepared to start because you all are so conversational and such good friends that I feel like you could just talk and yeah, it'd be great. But I think that we should get going. So thank you everybody for coming on this Monday afternoon to this roundtable titled Believers and Skeptics in the Writing of Mormon History. My name is Micah Chang, and I am an assistant professor of history at Montana State University. I do agricultural history, the history of race, and religious history. So I was really excited when my colleague Amanda invited me to come moderate. She said it would be a great discussion, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what all these amazing panelists have to say. Just a couple notes. This is being recorded, and I think it will be disseminated later on. Is that correct, Amanda? Okay. And then please hold your questions for the end, but if questions do come up as you're listening to the panelists talk, you can direct those to me, and during the Q&A, I will just facilitate questions and direct them at panelists if they are directed at someone in particular. And if you're having difficulty hearing or anything, you can also send me a message and I will let everyone know while they're focusing on their roundtable discussion. So without further ado, why don't we have everybody go around in the order that they're listed on this. So Lindsay first, and then Benjamin, and then Amanda, and then Brian. Introduce yourself, who you are, what you're working on, where you are. Yeah, so go ahead.
Okay, thanks. My name is Lindsay Hanson Park. I am the executive director of an organization called the Sunstone Education Foundation. It's an organization that's been around almost 50 years. And when I inherited it, it was just such a fun, cool thing because it's an open forum for scholars to come and discuss issues in and around Mormonism. And I use the word Mormon to describe all of the different groups that come from the Joseph Smith Restoration tradition, including the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, of which I'm a member and which I grew up in. I do Mormon history. I have a podcast called Year of Polygamy, which is the history of Mormon polygamy, and I co-host a podcast with Brian Buchanan, who is on the call, about, excuse me, about the history of Mormonism, and we go in chronological order as best we can. And I do a lot of work in film now and consulting, and so that's and I'm in Salt Lake City. So thanks for having me.
My name is Benjamin Park. I teach at Sam Houston State University. I'm the American religious historian here. I am the author of a couple books relevant to this discussion: Kingdom of Nauvoo, The Rise and Fall of a Religious Empire on the American Frontier, and more recently, American Zion, A New History of Mormonism, which just came out last week. And the other thing to know about me is I'm a devoted listener of the Sunstone Mormon History podcast.
and I'm Amanda Hendrix-Komoto. I'm an assistant professor here at Montana State University, where my research focuses on religion, sexuality, and race in the American West. Last year, I published a book called Imperial Zions, Race, Religion, and Family in the American West and the Pacific, which examines Latter-day Saint missionary work among Native Americans and Polynesians. Yeah, Brian.
Hi, everybody. I'm Brian Buchanan. I work at Benchmark Books, which is my surroundings here. And I, as Lindsay mentioned, co-host the Sunstone History Podcast. I have about 9 million interests, but current projects are I am editing the diaries of Michael Quinn, which are very fun. And then with a friend of ours, Christina Rossetti, editing the journals and correspondence of Joseph Musser, who is a very important early Mormon fundamentalist.
Great, thank you all. So I have a list of questions here that the panelists received beforehand, and I'll just start with the first question, but I have a feeling with this group, it's going to be pretty organic to jump from topic to topic. So I'll just step in when necessary and let conversation flow. But I think it's going to be a very interesting discussion we have here between you all. So the question that I want to start with is, how do you approach the study of religious history? For you, what is the difference between academic and the academic study of religion and devotional history? So why don't we start with maybe Lindsay, because we can come back on the full circle and then let it go.
Okay, yeah, thanks. That's an important question. So I'm not a classically trained historian, and I think it's important to always sort of state that because in the community that I come from an upbringing of public history, meaning my mom dresses in pioneer garb and she goes to libraries and youth conferences and church activities and schools and teaches pioneer history. So I grew up believing, as I still believe, that like my cultural heritage and history is a story that I get to participate in and to share. And so I started doing the same thing, telling the history of our people, of my culture and my ancestors. But there's also a recognition that there are people that are trained and there are proper trainings and credentials for a reason, because this history needs to be told in the best possible way, especially in a community like mine where the stakes are so high. And what I mean by that is when we're talking about a history that a lot of religious beliefs sort of hinge on when it comes to truth claims and the truth of Mormon history and what happened in the past, the stakes are high. This affects people's entire lives, the choices they make, the beliefs that they have, the way that they structure their families. And so that makes our community history very fraught and political sometimes. And I'm always trying to engage it in a way that is as responsible as possible. I'm very lucky that I have a lot of good mentors around me, like yourselves, who are trained, who, as I've told the history in a more public way and a more sort of folksy, heritage-based, accessible way, historians are helping me understand, the limits of that medium, and also, the important ways in how we view and talk about things, because it does matter. This history can be very painful for people who are encountering it for the first time, who grew up with a different narrative. And so for me, it's something that we have to approach with a great responsibility and care. And because I feel so invested in my community and in my cultural heritage, I try to always be as responsible as possible. Of course, I have biases and I have feelings. I even have my own anger sometimes about the mismatch of what I grew up thinking was the story of our people to what the documents and what the evidence suggests. And so I always try to be really upfront about that, because, there's this sort of myth that like a good historian has no biases. Everybody has biases. We just situate where we situate. And I think the best we can do is let the people that we're talking to know, here's where I situate, and this is how it colors my view. And then you can sort of, digest that from where you're sitting. And so I just feel really lucky that I get to do this at the level that I get to do it and work with such great people.
Yeah, building on that, I teach a number of graduate seminars on the historical method, and I'm teaching one this semester, and I was just recording a video for my students this morning where they had responded to a number of essays on the historian's craft. And one was a great essay by William Cronin, a very noted American historian, titled Doing History, where he talks about that history, perhaps more than any other academic discipline, is something that is practiced by many people with a broad range of training and backgrounds, that it is the most conducive to amateur participation, which has both benefits and downsides. The benefit is history is something that everyone feels like they can do, and that's great. That makes it relevant, especially when you're discussing a religion like Mormonism. History is part of that sacred narrative. And some people have said over the years that Mormonism doesn't have a theology, they have a history. And therefore, that makes many people within the tradition devoted to history. I was raised in the Mormon tradition, so I was raised by parents who taught me about our pioneer ancestors. But I was taught history a certain way. History taught in Sunday school has a specific set of goals, and that goal is to reaffirm the divine nature of the faith, and that's to be expected in a religion. That's the job. And so you think about Joseph Smith dictates a revelation on the day that the Mormon Church was founded, April 6, 1830, declaring that there shall be a record kept among you. So placing history at the forefront of the Mormon tradition. But that same revelation goes on to explain that that record is specifically designed to declare that Joseph Smith is a prophet, seer, and revelator, meaning that history in the Mormon theological vein is meant to reaffirm those truth claims. Now, of course, those who go into academic history have a different agenda and have a different set of tools. Rather than reaffirming divine truth claims, they're trying to understand historical actors within their context, and in the classic definition of history, dictate change over time. And so you see at that very start, there is a core juxtaposition or contradiction between these two historical approaches. In a devotional context in Mormonism, the goal of history is to show that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, to show that the religion is timeless. Whereas in the academic field of history, the goal is to show change over time. And of course, because of those two distinctions, there's going to be a lot of fighting and conflicts over the lessons, which is why I don't think we should be surprised when we see so much contested space. I have a lot more to say, but I'll go ahead and pause opening remarks there.
Thanks, Ben. Like Ben, I teach at a state university. In fact, I just got a message from the graduate students assuring me that they're all huddled around one computer watching in the carols. So we'll say hello to them. I think, unlike some of the other panelists, and I think most people know this, I was not raised a Latter-day Saint. I was born to a Catholic mother who her grandmother had read tea leaves and held spiritualist meetings in their home. And then my dad was a Jack Mormon. He had been president of his seminary in high school and then quickly fell away from that. And whether or not he's ex-Mormon or Jack Mormon depends on the year that you ask him to this day. And for me, Mormon history in many ways is an attempt to understand the world that I was born into and how we get to the place where we are politically, socially, culturally. And one of the things that I have recently begun to question is the divide between an amateur and a public historian and an academic historian, because I think one of the things that we don't often talk about is academic historians are reliant on the narratives that amateur and public historians produce. And a lot of the early histories that we turn to are those that were written by people who we would consider academic or public historians. And scholars like Bonnie Smith have pointed out that originally in the 20th century, the big difference between an academic historian and an amateur historian was gender. Women became amateur historians because they could not access the academy, and therefore their experiences were shut out and labeled less than, whereas academic historians were male. And so when I approach history, I am bringing some of the same motivations that an amateur or public historian would have, trying to understand my present, trying to understand how history got us there. But I've also been trained in the academy. And therefore, my goal is still to place these very personal, intimate stories into American history as a whole, and to understand how Mormonism or how the history of Idaho and Utah fits into that larger story. And as a scholar of women's history, as a feminist, my history is also deeply political. The difference, I think, between what I do and what some people do when they look at history is I'm still trying to understand historical actors on their own terms. But the question I next ask is, okay, so if they were this way, what has that bequeathed us as a legacy? And then what do we do with that? If we know that people in the 19th century enslaved people and that continues to affect us to the present, we need to understand that past, but it's not enough. The next question is, how do we then respond? And so I consider myself an academic historian, but I acknowledge that that's a lot grayer and mushier than I think we often recognize.
Working in a bookstore where we specialize in Mormonism, particularly Mormon history, it's watching this play out in the trenches with people. And, here we carry books that are overtly academic history. We carry books that are overtly devotional history, but then there's also middle areas. And you have a project like the Joseph Smith Papers that a lot of our friends work with, and we know quite well, and we know them, we know their training, we know their motivations and everything. And it was fascinating to be at the event that celebrated the completion of that project and to hear about the nuts and bolts of it, and then also have an apostle from the LDS Church talk up and then interpret that work in a faith promoting sense. And so it's, for me, it's fascinating to watch how those motivations sometimes clash, but then also mesh well at times. And so it's an ongoing process. And I think part of it is understanding both why the history is being written, who it's designed for, and then as a reader also knowing that. And so there's a lot of factors in play there.
Before I move on, because I'm looking at the rest of the questions and I feel like you all are kind of hitting on them and you are also in dialogue with one another. Does anyone want to respond to another panelist's interpretation or response to that question?
Yeah, let me. I think one of the points that Amanda brought up that I think is really important about the gendered nature of amateur history. To expand that further, Mormon history in many regards has been built by the work of amateurs in general. That you look over the years, because history has been such a central part of the Mormon tradition, it makes sense then that so many members view history as significant. Even those who have left the church or now, are anti-Mormon or still devoted believers, one thing that they carry with them is the importance of that history. And so when I look at my, bookcase behind me and my shelves that are devoted to Mormon history, so many of them are written by people who don't have a doctorate in history or don't have an academic appointment. And those are crucial books. And like the space of Mormon history always has to make room for good reason. I think it's also important to note that there are great benefits that come from this engagement. You attend academic conferences on history on any other topic, and it's sometimes hard to get people into those rooms listening to those academic papers. You go to the Mormon History Association conference, and those rooms are filled with people. Because Mormon history comes with stakes. And of course, we'll talk about some of the downsides that come with that. But I think the energy and excitement that comes over history is such a great thing that is driven because of this consistent attachment to history, whether you have advanced degrees in it or not.
Can I say something about that too? So it's been interesting because Brian Buchanan and I have been friends for a really long time. He's such a good partner in this history with me, and so he and I will often do interviews or things together. And we have noticed, kind of jokingly, that like whenever we're talking about history, whenever there's YouTube comments or whatever, they're always saying to me, well, we want to see her sources. Well, I don't think that that's right. They want to correct me. They don't correct Brian. And we've realized the disparity. Mormonism is very gendered in general. I think when I say something, it doesn't carry the weight that it does with a man or a credentialed historian. And I'm aware of that. And it's frustrating sometimes, especially because, and I'll have historians do it. They'll say, like, I don't know if that's right or that's right. And I'll be like, I read this, here's the document, here's my evidence. What I've learned over time is that people can come at how I talk about it, my lack of credentials. That's sort of my weak spot, if you want to say that. And when there's a history with such boundary maintenance and people are like trying to like verify, which is good, we want that, we want people to verify, usually they'll come at my character, but they can't come at my sources. And that's what I've learned. And I think that that's why I've done well in this space, because I learned, okay, I'm an amateur, I don't have the credentials, but what I can do is get the history as best and accurate as possible. And so the only time my feelings get really hurt is if someone can like say that my source doesn't work for this reason or that reason. And so that's kind of my perspective from gender. But to your point, Ben, about the amateur part, I appreciate that you guys are holding space for the amateur histories, because that's important too. But as someone who engages that and grew up in that tradition and has a family who tells that kind of history, there are some serious limits to it. And Brian and I talk about this on our podcast a lot. I love reading family histories. I read them all the time. I love hearing how people talk about it. But those family histories and those personal amateur histories are often infused with a lot of myth. In our community especially, we are asked to be a record keeping people, and there is I would say, a complex that people have developed that whatever they write in their journal, someday their kids are going to read. And so there's a lot of self-editing in our community. And so we have to factor that in too, in the way that people tell stories. There's the history of what actually happened and what they felt about it and what they want people to know. And I'm just really lucky that because I come from that tradition, I'm able to sort of understand that. And that I think that that helps Brian and I parse out fact from fiction. But again, everything we're talking about right now is the other problem with history. We're relying on documents. Documentary history is probably the best history that we can work with right now. And people aren't always honest in documents. They leave a lot of things out in documents. Documents do not tell the whole history. And so I think we have to be aware of that as well.
Amanda or Brian, do you have a response? Okay.
One
Then
interesting
let's
thing.
go.
Sorry, Mike.
Okay, go ahead.
Peter didn't want to let me unmute. An interesting thing, obviously, and one of the unique things about Mormon history is the fact that it's not always just history, but it is, like Ben mentioned, truth claims too. And it's very common that it just devolves into a cage match, and we're either fighting truth claims or upholding them. And that's a big part of it. And that's and that is obviously because Mormonism is such a new religion, comparatively speaking, and because it does have such bold claims. And so because there is a plethora of records that can be used to look at these truth claims, because they are so tied to history, it does make it somewhat of a unique religious history and writing challenge.
I think we're kind of skirting around this question, so I'll put it out there as the next directed question. But a few of you have mentioned how Mormon history is different than a lot of subfields in religious history, in that there's a very engaged audience of both believing Latter-day Saints and ex-Mormons and everything in between. This is, it's interesting for me as somebody who studies the history of American Protestantism, focusing on the Northern Plains with Anabaptist people. There is not the same showing at conference papers, as Benjamin said, on Hutterites in Montana. But I'm wondering if you all could address this a little bit more directly and talk about how Mormon history, as Brian was just saying, the stakes over truth claims, how it has benefited the field of Mormon history, this relationship between the academic and devotional, as well as how it has constrained it.
I think one of the benefits are quite clear. For one thing, people buy books in Mormon history, which is, as someone who's written books on non-Mormon history and books on Mormon history, the difference is hard to quantify because people are actually engaged. And so it's wonderful as a historian to know that your works mean something to people. The downside, of course, is that when your work challenges some of those foundational ideas, it can get it can get quite heated. And so I'll highlight at least two issues here. One is when you're challenging sacred stories, you have to be careful, right? Because you're taking people's religious beliefs in your hands. And so, not to say that historians are supposed to be caretakers of religion, they're not. But I think it's one thing to at least keep in mind the responsibility of engaging respectfully of religion, because you are challenging things that are at the core of their belief system. And sometimes that can lead to some debates. Those who are familiar with Mormon history know that there have been moments of deep and tense clashes between historians and the faithful. So that's one worry. The other worry about this connection to the broad and lively LDS audience is that the terms on which you write and the topics you focus on and the frameworks you use can often be derivative of the Mormon tradition writ large, right? That you're going to be asking questions depending on that tradition rather than asking questions based on historical analysis or the broader field. And that can lead to perpetuating or reaffirming things. So for instance, if you're writing on an LDS tradition, you might just focus on LDS leaders and prophets because that's how LDS instruction happens, and to break away from that mold takes a lot. And it also means that you're kind of perpetuating views of seeing, patriarchal structures or white supremacy or all these elements that are embedded within religious cultures like Mormonism that scholars have to be aware of. And when you're deeply connected to this engaged Latter-day Saint audience, divorcing yourself from those cultural tethers can be quite difficult.
One thing I want to go ahead, Lindsay.
Amanda.
You go first.
Go ahead.
You go first. Yeah, I'll go next.
Well, I want to say that as a Mormon, I'm afflicted with this sense of Mormon exceptionalism. And it's deeply embedded in us as faithful members. And when you leave the church or challenge the church, it is deeply embedded in the ex-Mormon community too. Like, we just think we're the most special and the most interesting. And so with that bias out there, I think Mormon history is so fascinating. And that's why I think so many people engage it. But like Ben was saying, it's so fraught, and you can tell this because when you ask someone about their experience, if they grew up in the church or if they're a member, we all have all these labels. We have to go through our bona fides. We're like, I say things like, I'm a Latter-day Saint, or we have ex-Mormon, Jack Mormon, post-Mormon. We have all of these labels. You can't just say, yeah, I'm a Mormon, right? And that's a complicated thing for me because I have a lot of those labels, components within me all the time. And I think that that's a reflection, that's a symptom of like the politics within this space. We all have to say that because in our tradition, there is a long history that unless you are faithful, and by faithful, I don't mean what you believe, because I don't think actually people that listen to my history or challenge my history care if I pray to God or not. They don't want to know about my testimony. They want to know how loyal I am to the institution. And so when we're talking about these, what I call faith politics, they want to know my proximity to the brethren, to the orthodoxy, to the institution. And if it is a little discursive or far away from that, or distance from loyalty to the institution, then there's a whole section of our community that says, I don't have to listen to you. If you're not loyal to the institution, anything you say is heretical, and we don't have to pay attention to that. And so that has been a really frustrating, challenging, part of the history. But then someone like Ben, Ben is I think one of our greatest assets in Mormon history right now. He is telling history in a public way, getting exposure on these stories that are important to us. But if he doesn't, come at the church hard enough, if he's what people consider too loyal to the history in their reading, then they'll say, oh, he's a faithful apologist. That's on the other side. There's this accusation that if you're too generous or just honest about some of the, rewarding things in our cultural heritage, then you're an apologist. And so it's so fraught. And I look at that as a symptom of a people who, and a religion that has years of trauma, years of what we call persecution. But to me, it's just trauma. There's a lot of violence in Mormon history. We don't like to acknowledge that, but there is. And trauma makes people think in black and white. It's this or this. And so our culture and our tradition is not practiced at the grays. We do not like gray. We want black and white. We want the Mormon exceptionalism. And I think that that's a huge challenge. And of course, it's not specific to Mormonism. Everyone struggles with that. America has this complex as well. But I think it's a barrier for people to really get at the good history, because the reality is life is not black and white. Villains and saints are like really not a thing. And so the people and the historical figures that we're talking about are complicated. They've made good choices, what we'd consider good choices, and they make choices that we would consider harmful or bad. And that's a complexity that a lot of people don't want to hold. And people engage in Mormon history because most of them that are from our tradition are trying to work out within themselves, is it true or false? And I would like to hear Brian's talk on this, because this frustrates Brian. Brian doesn't like to engage in history to prove it true or false. We're not doing missionary work from either side. And I think that that is a huge, complicated thing. And I also want to hold space for people that have a lot of pain and conflicting feelings for this, because, like we said, this history does affect every choice that you make if you are a believer. And so I understand why people feel like the stakes are high. They certainly have been for me. But I think good historians really have to try to put those questions aside and just go with where the evidence is.
Having done quite a bit of work in fundamentalist Mormon history, this is really apparent because there's very little work that's been done so far that is not trying to fight from one or the other two sides over authority claims. And so, especially as you get out into the different kinds of Mormonisms, you see that the academic versus devotional becomes really difficult. And in the mainstream LDS tradition, that's particularly so because there is a long-standing mistrust of academic history. And usually that's that's implicit, but at times it's been explicit from LDS leaders. And we got to see that boil down into a historians versus leaders reduction in the 70s with Leonard Arrington. And that became a very real institutional level look at how that plays out. And so it is really hard. And I did like Ben pointed out, it is important to be respectful of beliefs as you do it. But respect doesn't equal defense always. And so that's important to maintain a boundary between respect and defending whatever side of the belief spectrum might be.
There's a couple of things that have sort of stood out to me over the years in Mormon history. I think there's a big tension within Mormon theology over the idea that there are prophets who are still speaking and this deep investment in historical figures. And I don't think you see that same deep investment in historical figures in other religious traditions. Like, I'm Methodist and attend a Methodist church, and I distinctly remember in graduate school, I brought in a history of Methodism that I was reading for my comprehensive exams. And the pastor saw it and said, "Oh God, why are you reading that? You must be so bored," because they couldn't fathom why anyone would want to read Methodist history, which fair, it was a very, very boring book. And I find that investment fascinating because I, as a non-Mormon, have never thought of my work as having anything to do with somebody's faith claims. I cannot imagine somebody reading my book and losing their faith over it, because for me, these are historical actors that are people who do both good and bad things. And I've also found as a non-Mormon that people are more forgiving of the way that I write. And the most common reaction I get is, "I couldn't believe how kind you were to us." And I write about Mormon colonialism and include massacres of Native people. And I think Latter-day Saints are often surprised that I just didn't like go for their throat, because that's sort of the persecution narrative. That's what they're expecting. And the thing that's sort of unsaid that I don't think people often think about is they'll be much more critical of Ben or Lindsay or Brian. But I'm the non-believer. Like, I start from the assumption, right, that Joseph Smith is not a prophet, that there were no golden plates. If I didn't start from that assumption, I would need to go like be baptized. But people assume that people who actually have had that belief at some point are more scary, are more potentially dangerous than somebody like me who's never held that belief. The thing that I want to return to that Ben said is, I think one of the biggest problems about this sort of deep faith investment in Mormon history is that it really does limit what we consider important. Mormon history is really northern Utah history. Salt Lake and maybe a couple of surrounding counties. It doesn't go into southern Utah. It doesn't go into Idaho. It doesn't really go into Wyoming or Arizona or Mexico or the Pacific Islands. It's really about northern Utah. And for the most part, it's about the same couple of families. And so Mormon history really only tells a very small sliver of what's out there. It's not very much interested in the experiences of non-elite women, of non-elite men. There's been more history of Black Mormons recently, but really there's very little being done on people of color. And it's because of the deep investment of power structures and of faith claims. The Church History Library I don't think has ever rejected my request to see something. And it's because I write about people that they don't care about, that people who are on the margins, who aren't going to affect anybody's faith. So what do they care if I look at their diary? And it's really a shame because there's some fascinating things going on in the margins, but it's not sort of the center of Mormon history.
So we have a lot of people here listening, so I think it speaks to the quality of this conversation. So I'm going to finish and combine these last few questions because I think this one's an interesting one to finish with, and then we'll have plenty of times for question and answers. How has the field of Mormon history changed since you've first engaged it? And then also, what advice would you give to somebody who is now entering Mormon history or Mormon studies?
Yeah, I'll have a quick answer to that. And I think it's also important to note the difference between those two things, Mormon history and Mormon studies, because being careful on our language here can avoid some misconceptions. Because Mormon history is, just writing about the past of all the different faith traditions that date back to Joseph Smith. And Mormon history can be on a broad spectrum of different types of approaches, from amateur to academic. Whereas Mormon studies, at least as I define it, is an explicitly academic conversation in which scholars from a number of different disciplines and sub-disciplines, whether it be history or political science or English, are using Mormon to address academic issues. And I think it's sometimes tempting, especially people from my background with higher education who work at an academic institution, who might see this as a hierarchy, right? The Mormon studies type of work is most important because it's the academics with their highfalutin PhDs speaking down from their ivory towers and connecting these academic discussions. Whereas I think that's a fraudulent view of viewing the field, because they're just speaking about similar topics in different ways to different audiences for different purposes. So what I've seen in the changes in the field of Mormon history, there's of course been a bit more of a professionalization that's constantly going on, a slow, more and more people participating in the broader academy. Mormon studies, we're seeing much more rigorous engagement on especially topics that have long been ignored, like colonialism, and Amanda's book is a phenomenal example of that. We're seeing, thankfully, more work on Mormons of color, which of course we need to see more on. And so I think we're seeing a professionalization of Mormon history, but even while we're doing that, we can't forget the importance of Mormon history as a community engagement. And so I'll remark on one last disciplinary distinction here that I think is important. There's the academic Mormon history, where you're trying to follow academic patterns of engagement. And then I think there's also activist history in Mormon history, where you are explicitly using Mormon history for certain agendas. And a lot of that is bad, right? We can all think of specific people and examples of using history and manipulating history to fit a certain ideological agenda. But I also think you can think of examples where activist history has a purpose and a mission. I think of the great feminist Mormon scholars in the 1970s and 1980s who use the tools of history to push for social change. And I think that's good. And so I think thinking about all these different approaches to history and how they fit in with one another, and sometimes don't, work within a broader corpus of historical engagement.
I want to talk about activist history for a minute. I'm glad you brought that up, Ben, because I think that that's an important part. I would say that if I'm being completely honest, there's an aspect of my work that is activism, and I try to be very open about that. So, for example, I said at the beginning of this that I do work in film. One of the most recent controversies that I was engaged in was a show called Under the Banner of Heaven. I did the consulting work on that, and it was very fraught. It was not well received within our community in some spaces because they felt like it was too dark of a portrayal of certain kinds of Mormonism, or didn't represent all the good. It wasn't a balanced view. For me, it was a very accurate view of a Mormonism that I'm very familiar with, and that I study and that I've interacted personally with on on levels. So I feel very proud of that project and in integrity with that. For me, because of the work that I do, because I am in a space where I get, if not daily, certainly weekly, letters from people in pain over these issues, in pain over abuse, sexual abuse in the community, all of those things. It's very difficult for me to maintain a positive view on Mormonism sometimes, because I get to see the shadow sides. I'm in the trenches and the slogs of it, and I'm constantly trying to remember the beauty that that I have had from it, the connections that I have, the good people that I know from it, and it's hard. But if I were to say that I have an activist bent, to me, I think getting at the truth, no matter where it is or where we find it, whenever someone touches on truth, that's where medicine is. And I'm very interested in that idea. And as you know, as a filmmaker now and a storyteller in that medium, it's tricky because the historian part of my brain is like, we have to make everything accurate all the time. And it should be easy. And now that I'm in film and you're working with thousands of people on crews and budgets and people who have no, idea about Mormonism, I'm realizing how tense that conflict is and how difficult it is to translate the truth, the accuracy on the screen. And so where I've aligned my values is, if we can touch on a true narrative, some truth, then there's some medicine there. And I acknowledge there's some hubris there. Again, I'm afflicted with Mormon exceptionalism. It's not my job to heal the world or heal our community, but I do feel a great responsibility to always try to find that truth, because I do think our community has a lot of pain. We have a lot of unacknowledged pain. The history contributes to that. And wherever you situate around the world, you are a human being interacting with a religion that sometimes can lean towards orthodoxy as a way to keep things in check, and that orthodoxy causes pain. So I would say, if there's an activism in the work that I do, it's to try to touch on a truth, even if it's a truth I don't like or I don't agree with, because if you can find truth wherever it is, and even if you're not Mormon and you respond to this truth, there's some medicine there.
And I think that's a really great example of feminist theory. I mean, women's history, the history written by people of color, has always been activist history. And that's one of the fundamental foundations of feminist scholarship. And when I teach the Intro to Women's Studies classes, one of the objectives that we have written for our students is that they will know how to take their academic practice and use it to advocate for social change. And so I think one of the questions when looking at scholarship and its assumptions is what the background of the scholar is, because anybody who has taken classes in ethnic studies departments or women's history will talk about activism. I do want to say to Ben, I always assumed, even though I'm at a university as well, that Mormon history was above Mormon studies in the hierarchy. And that religious studies and American studies are sort of a mishmash of just different disciplines, but not really able to stand on their own. Anyway, I think one of the things that I have noticed since I started in Mormon studies, which it's been over a decade now, is because of when I was born, which was in the 80s. I entered graduate school at a time when Mormon history seemed very hopeful. And there was a sense that Mormon history and the church as a whole was opening up, and that there were real possibilities for change. And I think because of national politics, but also because of some changes at some key institutions, there is less of that sense of hopefulness, and that in many ways, Mormon historians feel more embattled, and that their ability to say certain things if they want to be hired at certain church institutions is less than it used to be. And so in many ways, the field feels smaller than it used to. And that's at the same time that places like the University of Virginia and Claremont have created Mormon studies chairs and have offered more opportunities to believing Latter-day Saints to be involved in academia than there used to be. And so Mormon history feels very, very much smaller than it used to. And I've seen more studies of people of color. I haven't seen much movement on gender within the field since I've been involved. There hasn't been much done on Mexican Americans and Mormons, or Mexico and Mormons. There hasn't been much done, although this is changing because of Farina King, Thomas Murphy, and some other people, on Native American history, Elise Boxer. And so some of it's changing, but it still feels very much the same. And it feels like some of the external politics are affecting that. And I guess to answer Micah's second question of what I would say to somebody who's just starting out is that one of the important things to do is to be brave and not to allow some of those politics to affect your work, because you're going to piss somebody off at some point, and there's nothing you can do to stop that. And so you just need to know that you've done the best that you can, and that you've done good scholarship and tried to find the truth that you want to speak. And then to come back to something that Brian said, and I think Ben said as well, also be compassionate. Remember that you are speaking about somebody's faith. And I like to imagine when I'm writing that, and in some cases this is true, that I know the descendants of the people that I'm writing about, and that I have to be able to justify what I say about these people to their family members. And so I guess that's sort of my feelings about the field right now.
Yeah, and let me, before I'm sure Brian's going to jump in, I want to continue on one point that Amanda made. When it comes to institutional influence over the field of Mormon studies, as many know, a lot of the pillars that have been holding up academic work, especially universities and academic institutions in America, have been crumbling with the lack of financial and just institutional support for the humanities in general. And in this world where there is a decreasing number of resources granted to history, private funding bodies like churches and other institutions are going to play an increasingly outsized role, which is why I think Amanda's general pessimism is justified, because I think we're going to see that those politics, those institutional cultural politics that dominate the Latter-day Saint community, are going to play an increased role in academic discussions just by sheer influence of money and other real life things that I wish didn't play as large of a role in academic pursuits as they do.
Since I'm a big fan of nuts and bolts, I'm going to talk about my love of what's happening with the nuts and bolts over the last 10, 20 years. The explosion of sources and their availability. That may be still in-house, but more and more that's digitized, and that's just amazing. I mean, we just in our career lifetimes, think about the amazing things that previous generations of scholars wanted to see and couldn't, and we can sit literally in our jammies and get to them. Part of that is good. That means we have a lot of things available. The bad side of that is I think it creates a feeling of overwhelm for people, and they're like, I don't want to deal with any of it. And so often I'll see a book come out and I'm like, ooh, this is going to have some new things. Nothing. So my advice to people who are thinking about getting in is, yes, do it. Be brave. Go for it. There are so many opportunities, so many peoples, periods, topics that just are not receiving good quality treatments that they deserve. And part of that too is you have to do work in sources. And I get so tired of seeing the same book written 3 or 4 times, and meanwhile a fascinating topic. You might have somebody that has this killer diary that's digitized and waiting, and it gets ignored. So my advice would be, yes, jump in and take advantage of this explosion of sources.
I want to respond to a few things. First of all, Brian gets so bothered if someone doesn't go in the archives and find new stuff. I love that about him. It keeps me on my game. When we're talking about, Amanda, what you said about this decrease, I actually don't think, I could be wrong because I'm not in the academic institutions, and I understand and I acknowledge that it's a very challenging time for higher learning, for education, for long form. It's kind of a scary time. But I also think that there's another thing happening, which is the relevancy of Mormonism in general. And I think that this is an institutional problem in Mormonism. They are struggling and grappling with finding a way to make Mormonism relevant. If you talk to younger generations, they don't care about Mormon history because they don't care about Mormonism. There are more opportunities now than my generation, and certainly my mother and grandmother's generation as a Mormon, to, at least in America, to just walk away from the community. Where I come from in Utah, like, it was your whole world, it was your business, it was your life. You couldn't just abandon it. And that's where a lot of course, the pain comes from. But now, because of the internet and the globalization of Mormonism, I think people can walk away, and the church is struggling. I mean, the mainstream LDS church, and I would say actually this is happening in fundamentalist communities everywhere. People are leaving the church. It is not offering them always the sort of comfort that it did when they are behind on issues, for example, on LGBT, issues like that. There's generations of people that just say, I don't need to figure this out. I don't need to understand this. I don't even want to know about it. All I know is that I think that the Mormons are homophobic, and they walk away. And so I think that that's kind of a trend that I'm seeing, and it makes me sad, because I think Mormonism is a microcosm of America, as of course Ben argues in his book. So I think it's important, but I do think that that is a challenge that we're going to see. And the other thing I was going to say is, when it comes to advice for people, I would say, to quote our apostle Elder Uchtdorf, come join with us. Like, this is a history that we want people to engage in. The more voices, the better. Brian's right that people get overwhelmed. But I actually, if I can lean into the better angels of my optimism, I don't like TikTok. It drives me crazy to see something that I spent, in the archives hours on in long form be cut down to like a 20-second dance video about polygamy or whatever. That's infuriating. But the optimism there is, people can engage with this in a new way with new technology. And we, even though we don't want to, or at least me as a Luddite, don't want to shift with it, that is the future. And so maybe it's an exciting creative challenge for historians to figure out how to engage with that. I am glad that people still feel like they can engage, even if it's on Snapchat, with Mormonism, because the history does matter. There is so much truth. There's so much medicine, as I said, in these lessons and in these stories that apply outside of Mormonism. So if you want to join with us. And I am so, to use Mormon parlance, grateful for non-Mormon historians like Amanda, like Christina Rossetti, who come and give us a different perspective, because there's this strong belief in our culture that, and I certainly experienced this with Under the Banner of Heaven, if you're not faithful, if you're not part of us, you can't tell this story. And I learned as a Mormon on set with Under the Banner of Heaven just how skewed my views were when I was confronted with how outsiders look. So we need outside perspectives. We need people to point things out to us. And that is so helpful. So I would say, don't let the boundary maintenance people tell you you don't belong. Everyone should be able to engage in this conversation.
Thank you all for, I know you're going to talk, Brian, but I'm going to actually turn it over to you in a sec, because I think I have a question for you from the audience. We have about 7 minutes for discussion, and I want to give the audience a chance to ask you all questions, because it's been a great and engaging conversation. The first one I have, and I'm going to direct this at Brian, is, other than the Joseph Smith Papers Project, is there a specific site that has digital images of historical sources? It would add a great deal of credibility if images of sources were shown. So I think they're asking for, what are some of these resources you're talking about?
Yes, boy, are there. And this comes to a surprise sometimes to people who still have the mentality that the LDS Church is hiding everything, is the Church History Library has digitized more pieces of Mormon history than any place on earth. Amazing things. Are there redactions? There are occasionally redactions. Are there still things we'd like to see? Yeah, there's still stuff we'd like to see. But guess what? There are thousands and thousands and thousands of images, sometimes transcripts of incredible resources. Sometimes you might be the first person who's looked at that since the person originally wrote it. So Church History Library is a fantastic site. BYU has digitized a lot of things. The U has digitized a lot of things, Utah State. And the nice part about institutions are libraries are fantastic, and the people that work there, archivists, are wonderful people. And if you go to them and say, you know what, I'm really interested in this, I can't make it out there, frequently they'll digitize it for you, and sometimes even for free. So yes, there are incredible resources. Any library that has Mormon history holdings has got something fun, and more they're digitizing it. So yes, there are many places where you can go see the originals in all their full color glory.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to add to that question?
I'll add really quick because no one ever thinks of them. The Huntington Library in California also has a large digitized collection that's fantastic.
And I think I cut you off, Brian. I think you're going to say something. I don't have any other question lined up yet. I think maybe someone's typing a really big one. But
I'll say to add on for those who might not just be aware, when Brian's saying the church history library, if you go to history.lds.org, history.church of Jesus Christ, I forget the new long name, the replacement, the main history.ldschurch.org, and then you go to catalog, and then if you just search in the catalog certain subjects or people, and it'll bring up the list. Many of those items that you'll then click on, they'll have a little symbol that says digital view, it's digitized. And so you can do historical research from your laptop at home if you just go to the LDS Church History's website and just start searching on the catalog. And you can even do a filter that say digitized sources, and it'll only show you all the sources that have been digitized.
That's actually what I was going to say is, and this in no way is selfish or represents my own preferences, but I love documentary editing. And I feel like the more journals, correspondence, meeting minutes, whatever that gets out there in an accessible format, then the better history comes from that. And so that's what I would say for people who are trying to get in. That to me is probably the best way to really jump in and make a contribution, is to work on something. Work on a diary, work on a collection of letters, work on meeting minutes, all these things that we have that will then allow historians to have the nuts and bolts to write better history. So that's my other plug.
Brian is working on this like grassroots thing called the Edith Romney Project, where he's encouraging people to transcribe things. And now AI can help us do that as well. But humans need to help edit, so we can work with this technology. That will help historians because every voice matters. For so long, the frustrating thing for me, and I get it because I've accused the church of doing this too. Sometimes it's like they're hiding the history. There have been people like Joseph Fielding Smith who are not fans of appreciating a true and complicated history. However, most people I know want these things out there. They want to get them out there. There are just not enough resources. And so help, that's a perfect way to do it. And if you are an ex-Mormon or leaving the church or leaving fundamentalism, Brian and I are really lucky that when fundamentalist sects like the FLDS have a big archive of stuff, they'll bring Brian and I in, so we get to be the first people to look at this stuff sometimes. But there's this impulse when you're angry or you're hurt or you're bored or you're cleaning your house to throw things away. And I would say, please do not throw away your family histories, your journals, anything that looks important. You can archive them now. If you don't trust the church history library, and I want to talk about that in a minute, go to the University of Utah or the Huntington or Utah Tech. There are so many great archives now that will take and scan these things. I want to make a plug for getting your stuff archived at the church. In the past, yes, there have been some fraught, politics with people giving stuff to the church and then never giving them back. That issue has been remedied. You can go and you can take whatever document or diary and you can be with them and watch them scan it and keep the originals. And what that does by giving it to the church, you are giving access to faithful scholars who might not know this history. So it's good for everybody. And so I would say, let's try our best to be generous with historians working in all the spaces. Some of the historians on the Joseph Smith Papers Project are some of the best historians I know. They are not enemies to history. It's the opposite. And so, yes, I know there's a complicated history with the church, and that distrust is real, and it was earned. And they still have a lot of institutional, trust to build back. but there are good people doing that. And so again, please get your stuff archived and help with us transcribing. You can Google Brian's Edith Romney project if you want to help with that.
And real quick, speaking of the Joseph Smith papers, Robin Jensen just sent me a link privately that I think was meant for everybody. But the link for the church history catalog is catalog.churchofjesuschrist.org. And I'm also going to plug Robin and a couple of other people at the Church History Library have an upcoming seminar that you can apply to on how to look at material book culture, teaching you how to read the actual physical pages of a manuscript or a item. So apply to that. I think they've extended the deadline to February 1st.
Okay. We're at time here, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. Those of you who asked questions or had comments for specific panelists, I will pass those on to them. I will email them to them directly. So just know that you're being heard. I would like to thank you all for your time and this discussion. And is contact information available for those who want to continue the discussion with you all? Just Google your names, I suppose. Yeah. So thank you again.